Okay, so welcome to our second panel. Well, you've done pretty well moving it together, sort of. Yeah, that's nice, good. And we feel like we're actually speaking to a group of you instead of one here, one there, one over there. Okay, so this panel is all about women's football and inclusion. So it's my great honour to introduce Para-Matilda Paralympian Ray Anderson. Nice to have you, Ray. Where's the other microphone? Here we go. Here you go. Thanks. We've got the co-founder, co-chair and honorary managing director of Moriarty Foundation, Ross Moriarty. Nice to have you, Ross.
Thanks, Tracey.
Yeah, I'm sorry you're all going to share that one mic. And Power to Play period and from Mount St. Mary's University, USA. Please welcome Associate Professor Sarah Zipp and all our panelists. Where do we start with women's football and inclusion? Because there's a temptation, I think we might have just alluded to it in the previous conversation, that we talk about inclusion sometimes just meaning the women into the men, instead of looking at all of the different groups of women that are out there and, you know, may be excluded for different kinds of reasons. Sarah, maybe you can start by giving us a bit of an overview of how you see this prism at the moment.
Well, thank you. Thank you for introducing me, Tracey. I'm glad to be here, coming all the way from the US. I'm a little bit sore from that Germany Columbia game. So the work I do is really on transforming environments for young athletes. So I'm trying to work on keeping girls in sport. We see a massive dropout of young people between the ages of around 11 and 14. And that's pretty universal. I mean, I'm from the States. I've done the research in 30 different countries, and it's very similar throughout. So we have this change during puberty. And so there are different elements, you know, by cultural and racial and ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds as well, for sure. But in general, we're not doing a good job of making friendly, welcoming, supportive spaces for young girls in sport. We're working to change that.
All right, and I'll come back to you on how we do that in just a moment. Ray, just give the room a bit of an overview of your own personal situation and how you've come to sport, what sport has meant to you, and how you see this discussion around inclusion.
I could really approach sport from both lenses, both being female and obviously physically disabled. For me, I couldn't get into sport until I was about 8 or 9, and that was soccer, football. Because of all the surgeries that I had, it was just not physically possible for me to get involved in sport and also commit to a team because I was in and out of hospital basically every 6 months of the year. So for me, to be able to firstly get into sport was a really special moment. For me, it was always mixed sports, so men, women, through our world programs and then eventually into the para pathways, which led me into alpine racing. So I was an alpine skier for the past since 2017. I converted from athletics to alpine skiing on a scholarship program, Show Potential. And then found my way back to football because of the insanely sexist and really demeaning environment that was alpine skiing. And that's universal, that's not just in Australia, that's worldwide. I think it is a very male-dominated sport, and certainly football is as well, but there's just something about the culture coming into football. As a disabled female, the boys were so much more welcoming. You know, you still have your year 1 or 2 men, but the culture that is football in Australia was something that was really special and something that I wanted to get involved in.
And Roz, where you see this paradigm at the moment?
Really interesting to hear from Ray that sounded like fry pan and fire, but it was really good to hear that football's in a welcoming place. We focus on Indigenous football in remote and regional regions. We train 2,000 kids a week. We have 60 coaches. We are 50% women coaches. We have 50% girls. We just made that decision that would happen. And so the projections around how long it's going to take for, more than 24% of girls in Australia, how long will it take for them to be 50%? How long will it take our 20% women coaches to be 50%? To us is about an intentional pathway that has to be faster. And the access to the sport, I don't think it sits at the player level. I think that's a very welcoming space. I think where the power sits, the FIFA level, the FA level, and the state federations, and really through the game, through the administration of the game. I was interested in your question about, what would be the one thing to make change. To me, it's leadership. To me, it's female leadership, female decision making, because women will bring women through.
Okay, so there's a whole lot to unpack in this discussion. I'm just going to stick with you for a moment, Ros, because it only took as long as making a decision in order to guarantee that it was 50-50 from the start. So why is it that decisions are not being made in sports bodies, locally, nationally, internationally, that say, yeah, okay, we're over debating this and having this conversation over and over again. Here's our decision.
I think one of the reasons is a refusal to invest. So you won't get the same return from the same investment first up. If you don't make that investment, you'll never get the return. So I think the refusal to actually say, well, we'll invest in this for the next 10 years because our goal is that this parity will be achieved quickly. It will only be progressed by women leaders. We don't have enough women leaders in positions of absolute power. You talk about being the president for how many 100 years, being male. It's been terrific to see that Miss Laura in there, but it's that top decision-making level that becomes difficult. So, from our experience, those decisions will take time to come to fruition. I think we've seen it in the A-Leagues, that when I was chair of the Football Council here, Women's Football Council ended a year ago, I'd still be in meetings the year before last with 13 men and me. I'm not a footballer, so I was happy to take that role, but I'm thinking if that's the norm around the decision-making table when the leagues are being separated, then these decisions are not going to be made in the interest of women's football and the investment that's required to get to parity, because the men have been invested in for a really long time. So who is going to invest in women and take that longer-term view?
So, there's a variety of women's organisations that have come to the fore, women on boards and all of these other things, women in football, a whole lot of women that are trying to do exactly that and to create change and to provide mentorship and leadership and hopefully help some of these women transition into some of these other sectors and areas. Does that work?
I think, as any women in the room will know, it's still a hard slog out there. You're talking about alpine skiing. I think I could talk about business. The decision makers are still largely men, and they're still largely non-diverse men. So to us, we can happily discuss this all day, but I guess to us, the intersectionality of this question is really important. It was fabulous to see the win last night. So thrilled for the Matildas. However, if you look at the Matildas, there is one diverse player on the field, Mary Fowler. Mary Fowler was not created by the system. Mary played her junior football in Ireland, and her dad has really been her coach and mentor. So to me, that speaks volumes of where has the pipeline been. We've got Lydia and Kyra on the bench, fantastic players, probably not going to be in this World Cup. What's happened between their careers, that would have been moving into the elite levels probably about 15 to 20 years ago? What has happened since? So that I think that's a lot.
Sarah, you might want to comment on this also, because we've been having these discussions for a very long time. Why isn't it working? Are we having the wrong discussion?
I think, we're trying to put a square peg in a round hole to a certain degree. And I've taught sport management, sport studies on gender and sport in 5 different countries. And these same questions are repeated again and again.
Which 5 countries are they?
The US, the Netherlands, the UK, Singapore, and Japan. And I was in Japan in 2019 in the lead up to the Olympics. And we had this wonderful group of master's students, part of the Olympic Legacy program. They were from all over the world. And we were up there talking about, well, this is happening, you know, like, we're all the way to like Alison Liet, like, you know, the Olympics, the founding of the Olympics, and then Title IX for the Americans that are around. And one of the students raised her hand and she said, well, why is it taking so long? Why are we still doing this? We all kind of threw up our hands and said, you know, we've been working on this for a long, long time. And some of these same discussions keep coming again and again. And I think, you know, that is really profound, just to say, we're going to start with 50-50. Like, that's just it. But I think a lot of times if you're seeing, you know, new programs develop, and we'll bring the women along slowly. We're going to get it started first, and then we'll make space for you. And it's like, well, we've been listening to that for 50 years. And so it's, how do you get to that point? And I think, yes, the systems, the people in charge, the decision makers makes a big difference. Not only is it so male dominated, but also very white, very European. You know, some of the work that I do around young people, not only are adolescents dealing with a lot of body image issues. I know Vandy can come up here and talk about that, and Katrina, you know, insecurities and changes in their body around puberty. But that also varies by culture, varies by what your cultural expectation is around puberty. Bodies are different. I mean, there's body diversity within ethnicities as well as between, but we see that, you know, for example, uniforms are designed, oftentimes they're just the boys' version, right? So they take the boys' version, double them, or maybe get a size smaller, shrink it and pink it, and give it to the girls, the boots that don't fit right, all those things. But then we also have different, you know, girls have hips, girls have breasts. And this all changes around that age, you know, between 11 and 14. And that can change, you know, at different paces for different people. And there's just no room for that in the system and the thinking if everyone making the decisions at the top is a white male.
Well,
right?
Traditionally, they've been a white male until there's an absolute catastrophe or a crisis of some sort. And then a female is brought in to kind of break that nexus. And then once that's all fixed, it just goes back to what it was. And so I'm really intrigued to know who's going to replace Fatma Samura as the Secretary General of FIFA. And is it going to be another white European man, you know, because they broke that mold after 112 years. Are they going to go straight back to it now that, you know, it's perceived that all the bad people have gone to jail? They've got the money back from the Department of Justice, and things are hunky-dory now, so we can just go back to the way it's always been. That will be interesting.
And if I could just add one more thing, I think sometimes we also see that the voices of women of color are often overlooked. And one example is, you know, around that Olympics, if you remember in the Tokyo Games, the women's Norwegian beach handball team took a fine from the European Handball Federation for wearing, for violating the uniform policy. They were meant to be in bikinis, and they wore short shorts. I mean, it's still quite a revealing, you know, costume for them, but they made that change. They took that stand because they felt more comfortable in that, and that got a ton of attention and ended up changing the rules. Well, if you, I was working with one of my colleagues who's a researcher from Sri Lanka, and she works in table tennis. She just said, we did this 30 years ago. The South Asian federations for table tennis had the rules changed so that they could wear long skirts, so that would be more inclusive for Muslim athletes. Well, when Muslim women, when women of color make these changes or make these, you know, have these campaigns, it's often overlooked in the media as well.
Yeah, definitely. That is one area where there's still so much work that needs to be done. Ray, in your experience, and I don't know, having had your sporting experience, do you feel inspired to want to move into these areas where you can keep pushing those boundaries and moving up that chain to be the sorts of leaders that we're talking about that are required, that are missing, that need to be in these big decision-making roles?
Yes. But I'm also very aware that we've constantly just been talking about it. Like, if you put someone in that leadership role, how is that going to change things? And I don't think it is just one person standing up the top and being like, this is what we're going to do, this is what it's going to look like, because it's a cultural thing. You talk about having, you know, putting a female at the top when something goes wrong. We did that in our fight skiing. We have now got a female coach, but the culture's still there. So it's how do we change the cultural perspective around it rather than just putting someone who has the experiences up the top to talk about them. And I think that's not something that we can just do by having these conversations today. It's something that's going to be progressive, and you know, we've seen it with women's sport. We now, like, Julie would sit down with us and be like, oh yeah, we were playing in this country with no crowds and on just like this terribly put together pitch. It was uneven, there was no cameras, whereas now we've got all these people watching the women in Australia. And what does that look like when we're talking about women in sport and then eventually para sport? We are now competing, we had World Cup last year. Hardly anyone knew. We're competing on the exact pitch she explained with a few spectators. So I don't think it is someone who just stands up there being like, yes, this is great, this is what we want. We've got Karina Hicks as our media person for Football Australia for the Para Matildas too. And she has big visions of having the exact same thing that we had for the Women's World Cup back in Melbourne in November for our Asia Cup. I bet no one in this room knew that there was an Asia Cup. So it's certainly a progressive thing. Like we can see that we are now 20, 30 years behind Matildas. So I don't think it's necessarily, as you say, having someone at the top. I think it's definitely how we talk about it, how we get people investing, how we get people more involved in being able to see what's going on so that they can actually want to be involved and want to be watching. That's just how, really.
Ros, you spoke about leadership. How does leadership go about this? Because, you know, in any room, there's going to be some people who are resistant to change, others who want to embrace it at 100 miles an hour. And you've got to manage all of that, don't you? And I'm no apologist for governing bodies, but I often think about this, that if you're an international governing body and you're looking at all of the federations around the world, you're dealing with very different cultural aspects. You're dealing with people who are at different paths or different levels of development, and societies that have completely different values, and all of that has to kind of be mixed. So are we trying to make things happen too quickly, or can they happen as quickly as it takes to make a decision?
Look, I think it's just been too slow. I don't believe it needs to be this slow, and I think there can be spot fires like our small program really. And also I think we have to be specific to where we can make change. So we can't really make change at the FIFA level, we're not powerful enough, Australia isn't powerful enough. But within Australia, I think it behoves us to try to identify how we shift things here. We have now a national team who's just got out of the group stage, got an easy feat. Let's see how they go. You know, a fantastic team that has the whole of Australia behind them. You know, what does it mean here in Australia? And I was thinking, you know, again, that last night, imagine if that was an AFL global match or a league global match. Do you think we wouldn't have any Indigenous players? Like, the Indigenous players would be the playmakers. So I think in Australia, we have to ask those questions. And, you know, our organisation wrote to FIFA last week and said there's a $357 million legacy fund that has been earmarked as the outcome of this Women's World Cup. And we've said, well, there is not a single Indigenous initiative for grassroots football. There is nothing that's going to bring players through. And I think the previous panel talked a bit about social impact, and, you know, certainly one of our goals is to bring players through. And we've, you know, already had a vice captain of the young Matildas. So we've got a couple of young boys out at Westfields who will, you know, probably shape to the soccer room at some point. But you know, the impact that this needs investment. You know, this really needs support. And within Australia, I think I had something quoted that more than 90% of that legacy fund is infrastructure. So I don't think infrastructure is going to solve the cultural issues that Grace talked about. I don't think it'll solve what our kids in the bush need. Our kids need really intensive, specific solutions for disadvantage, where parents cannot possibly get their kids to, you know, to a match 7 hours away. You know, when we put our 20 kids on a bus every month from Borroloola, 13 hours south of Darwin into Catherine, a 7-hour drive away because they just want to play football. You know, I don't think there's a federation that understands quite what those parameters are. So investment is really needed, but it's needed very specifically because the social outcomes will come. So once the kids love football, they're insanely talented. Any sport, you know, this happens to be football. But we just need to invest in giving them that opportunity, because the opportunity, they're not even at the opportunity start line, that they are so far removed from even discussions about, you know, how do we find the superstars of the future. It's about how do we give kids a hot meal 5 days a week, and that's really what we're doing. The rest, the talent will take care of itself. But, you know, where's the investment in the difference that football can make, and particularly women's football, you know, with those 1,000 girls that are training with us every week?
I want to open up the floor because I didn't do that the last panel. I'm really sorry. I've had 2 hours sleep because I flew from Melbourne after the game after I finished work last night. So my mind's not probably clicking as well as it should do. And I neglected to open it up to panel discussion, the floor discussion with the last panel. So are there any questions from the room? Yeah, and I'll bring this mic to you.
I just have a question for the panel, irrespective of your background. I just find with the cost of living going up all around the world, children that are maybe disadvantaged, they don't have the money, I just find that participating in the game is just getting out of reach, you know, just to go and play for a local club, and to try and promote this game, it's just getting out of reach for the young children because of the cost of living pressures. Is there a way that we can sort of accommodate for those people that are disadvantaged in that respect?
Ross, you should answer that because you have worked with people who have been in that situation from the start. That's
Yeah.
where they are.
Yeah, that's where they are. Exactly, Tracey. So we've got kids, you know, whose families in areas of 50% unemployment. It's impossible for those families to pay for registration, get the kids to the matches, provide them hot field to play on. So it's about providing the scaffolding. If football really is the social game it claims to be, if it really does have the impacts worldwide to be the world game, beautiful game, you know, creating beautiful stories, then this is one in Australia that has been neglected for the last, well, forever really, in this code. And we can see it in the talent that comes through the other codes. But it really is focused investment for specific outcomes for really disadvantaged kids. And unless those bridges are built and that scaffolding is provided, we're losing that population. We know that's where the flare is. We know that's where, you know, kids will play till after sundown. They'll play 7 hours a day. You know, in these communities, often football, in our communities, often football is the only thing on offer. So there's no escaping the fact that we need investment to provide those opportunities. I mean, I'm a volunteer. John from the foundation, my partner who was the first Aboriginal player selected for Australia, he's volunteer, and our board's volunteer, but we have terrific staff. So, you know, we have 75% Indigenous staff. So it's local solutions in local places. I'm sure this applies also to other kids around Australia who are not, you know, don't have access to the game for financial reasons, but the game needs to decide, you know, will the game support this access? Because we know how many stars come from impoverished communities. Not that we, you know, wish an impoverished community to be the source of our football talent, but we know that adversity breeds champions, and you know, that's a question for us here in Australia, because we do have that level of disadvantage in our own country.
Ray, have you asked? You go, Sarah. Yep.
I was just going to say that I think you raise a really interesting point too, based on like the timing, because we are sort of not everywhere, but commonly in an era of austerity, and one of the first things that go are these sport programs, programs for, you know, local councils at the school levels and things like that. So we've seen that, and what's happened in the field of sport for development, where we're looking at sport as a development component for young people. NGOs step in. So we have a lot of charities, NGOs stepping in to fulfill those needs, but they don't necessarily have the reach or the consistency as a government institution or a local institution. So it's really important to try to not rely too much on NGOs, and we have seen some success in public-private partnerships. So NGOs working in collaboration with local councils, schools, things like that can help fill those gaps. But you're right to say that there's definitely a strain on those systems now.
Ray?
Yeah, so outside of sport, I work for 2 non-profits, and we look at trying to advocate for people with disabilities' rights in sports and accessing recreational opportunities. And we found that a lot of people with disabilities are within these lower socioeconomic areas, even within Sydney. There's certainly you know, rural as well. So we are one of those NGOs that come in and try to implement sustainable opportunities. So we'll come in, we'll do a sports day. First off, do the sports day so these kids realise that they can get involved in sport, and it is something that is accessible for them. A lot of these kids are scared to even just try because they don't think there is those sort of adaptions available to them. And then for a lot of kids, say CP, there is a lot of medical intervention that can be done through NDIS. But then there's also the barrier to being able to access that, because even though it's a national scheme, it's not necessarily always that accessible. So trying to make those schemes that are already in place more accessible, and then trying to make sustainable changes is, I think, the biggest thing in these communities, because you know, we haven't just got large Indigenous communities there that are obviously far away from, you know, social sport, but also a lot of these sort of communities do have a lot of disability that isn't being treated as regularly as it should be.
I'm conscious of a comment that Kieran Perkins once made. He was a champion Olympic swimmer, for those international visitors who might not be aware of him, and he now runs the Australian Sports Commission. He's the CEO there, but he, after his retirement, after winning a couple of gold medals, he went into the banking and finance sector. Then he's come back into sport, and he went to his first swim meet, national championship, about 25 years after he left. And he was astounded that it was all done exactly the same way as when he was there. And he said that the world has changed. And so it was that sort of question about, sport and the way we've organised it. Is it still fit for purpose? And I think that's one of the big challenges too, because we don't live in such an organised time where everybody works the same hours and everyone's got the weekend free. And how do kids fit into that model, or older people who still want to be, performance driven? John, you had a question.
Yeah, it's just a follow-up, because I think the work that you all have been involved with foundations, with sport for development organizations, et cetera, is fantastic. But we have this kind of tension between countries who are now promoting, including Australia came out with a national wellbeing framework, that we need to see that participation in sport as an investment in national well-being. If we look at, we have several people here who have played professionally in Scandinavian countries where government provision for sports club membership is substantial. And then Sarah knows this from being in the United States, that we have a ridiculous pay for play model, where if your parents can afford to take you to more training sessions by paying more for the private club, you're much more likely to succeed as an athlete. So I guess my question is, what is the role and responsibility of governments to ensure that participation is accessible for all its citizens?
Yeah. This can take all day, John. I can't speak for all places, but I'll speak from the perspective from the US, just as a starting point. But we have decided as a society that sport is important and it's valuable. It's valuable for young people. It's valuable for building healthy societies. It's valuable for connecting people together. We've decided this collectively as a society, and that's why we, in the US, for example, fund it through sports in school. So we use taxpayer money, put that in schools, buy uniforms, build pitches and courts, and pay coaches to do this work with school children, because we think it's important. Well, if we're going to say that that's important as a society, then we need to make sure that that is available to everyone within that society. And recognizing that certain people, certain groups will have different barriers, whether that's women, whether that's people with disabilities, whether that's certain ethnic groups or religious groups and backgrounds. So I think so long as the government is saying that sport is important, they have an obligation to follow through with that and make sure that everyone has an opportunity to be included.
I don't know how to follow that. I need a person.
I think I can talk about it all day. To me, it's about accountability. It's about transparency. Do we know where the dollars that are given by the government to those who govern the game? Do we know where it goes? Do we know what it's being spent on? I think for a long time, a lot of money that came in for women's football went to men's football. And again, you can't solve everything by money. Our daughter plays for a local team still on Thursday nights. The girls have to wait until the guys don't get off the pitch, but they actually stop sitting on the pitch, on the good pitch, and then decide to go home. So they train on the bumpy ground until the guys decide to leave. I mean, who doesn't get what? You know, how can this still happen when there's a Women's World Cup here in Australia? And you know, it's that mix of investment and culture change. And culture change is harder, but the investment, I think, needs to be transparent. What are we seeing? Where's it going? Differences it's making in an Indigenous space, particularly girls and women. It's where is it? Where is the specific solution to a specific problem in a specific place? And that way we can drill down to some real change more quickly than we can otherwise.
I have an answer for that. The institutions that govern what you do, their ideologies are based in patriarchal constructs and are 70% white male. If you want to change the experience on the ground level, then you have to first change the ideology of the institution that's governing. So you're asking, why does the money not go there? The money doesn't go there because if you look at government, if we look at our government, Sarah and I, we know, we watch our Congress floor where a person can have a stroke on international television in front of everyone, and we don't own it. We don't own that we had a senator not be able to perform the duty of his office, but he's white male, so we don't question his ability to perform the duties of his office. But meanwhile, that same person is largely in control of the monies that go to female sport in our country. And he does not support female sport in our country. So where does it begin? It begins with our vote, which in my country is not ratified for women. So I know that I could lose my vote at any time. Okay, it begins with that level. They have to ratify my vote. I have to keep pushing, and that begins not with me, but with the fathers that want a better life for their daughters. And they have to fight with us to provide that level of accountability to our government so that industry does not control whether we get Planned Parenthood in some states. Because if we provide that Planned Parenthood, then we won't have factory workers. Because we know in America, factories are largely populated with the children of unwed mothers. And that's why we don't have Planned Parenthood in some states in the United States. We know that. We have to fight that at the governance level. We need more women to run for elected office. We need to have more honest conversations about the ethos of our country. We all need to understand that sport in America was where we trained men to be leaders. That's why women's sports were banned in the 1920s and 1930s in our country. And where we're just getting back sports, we lose traction in other areas of our society. So we have to be more collective, more organized as a collective, and we can't ever say, well, we've come a long way, baby. No, we haven't. The ground is still moving, and we have to keep walking, and we have to keep going that direction. Indigenous people teach us that the moment you are still and not serving your community, it dies. And so that's why they never give up. That's why they're always fighting. We have a lot to learn about how they behave in their society. We could benefit greatly from those ways of knowing and then bringing them into the public government of all of our governments.
Can I take that as a comment rather than a question? Did anyone want to respond to that?
In all this, we are rightfully focusing on what's happening at the top of the decision making and things like, we'll go for 50-50 right from the beginning and understanding like it goes all the way back to where you vote. But I think it's worthwhile just pausing and acknowledging that we're seeing some results from these grassroots movements too. I think a lot of athlete activism has come out with recently with some really positive results. You know, we can see that power of social media, all of that stuff is actually valuable. And so it's that top down and bottom up approach to making these kinds of changes can be very effective. And just as a couple of quick examples, there's recently a fight in the swimming federation in FINA over the swim caps that are designed to specifically fit the hair of people swimming from Africa. So it's like the coarse curly hair, it wasn't fitting correctly under the swim caps. The athletes made this, there was a new cap designed, they brought it forward, blah, blah, blah. It goes up to the chain. FINA rejects it, saying it doesn't fit the natural shape of the head, which begs the question, whose head, like what is the natural shape of whose head? And so they lost that fight initially, didn't give up, and now eventually it has been accepted. So we're seeing this coming from athletes and from athletes' experiences. The same thing I've worked in, and this is a really difficult place to do gender and sport work, but I've been working in Saudi Arabia through a student that I had as a PhD student when I was in Scotland for 5 years at the University of Stirling teaching there. And through his work, I've gotten to learn a lot about Indigenous and Islamic feminism. And I'd say the first thing we can do for anyone who's not from a Middle Eastern country, not from a Muslim country, is to find ways to be supportive allies, but not to bring in Western ideas, right? So there's a very inherent reaction to Westerners coming in with ideas, which is a fair enough point. We've gone in there to take their oil for centuries. So finding ways to support Indigenous Islamic feminism is really important in the world of sport, because there are millions of Muslim girls and women who want to play sport, who have the right to play sport, and are being systematically denied, either culturally or through actual legal restrictions in their countries. Now, Saudi Arabia is making a lot of changes, not necessarily for the right reasons, but they are making a lot of changes. And I think it's important to recognize that there are people there that we can help support. There are systems there, there's activism there. And when that comes from within, it can be very powerful. One of the mistakes I think that happens is that Westerners come in and think, we're going to help you make this change, and that immediately changes the context.
I think to your point, sorry, just finish, yeah, just to your point, and also your comment about Indigenous ways of knowing, I think Australia is a little bit out of step with the whole idea of self-determination here. It's something that's underpinning the whole political movement for the voice this year. It is topical, and yet grassroots football sits wholly outside the federation structure. So grassroots football for national teams, grassroots football as for us is the longest running and largest, by far the largest day-to-day delivery. Other programs in a couple of schools out of South Australia, with Travis Dodd, for instance, we are completely outside of the structure. Rather, the structure is endeavouring to put something in place that is delivered in a different way, more typically in the same way as other programs. So I think that being a step is a little tone deaf this year in particular, but the ramifications are that the investment into grassroots-led football by Indigenous programs, by majority Indigenous staff, majority Indigenous governed, are really not being recognised.
Thanks, Tracey. Just a comment. I think there's no doubt that, Poppy from Griffith University on the Gold Coast. There's no doubt that there's stronghold norms and cultural changes and shifts take a long, long time. They just don't happen over time. And we see small incremental changes in that space with women represented in leadership roles, where we can have a voice and influence decision making that will trickle down to all layers of sport management and administration and governance and so forth. But I have a bit of a more positive message, because I see a lot of governments, state governments, there's a lot of programs in place that support grassroots, and there's funding, there's access, there's subsidies for families. They are means tested, and each family per child, they can have access to $150 worth of money towards registration. it may not necessarily cover the full suite of expenses, but there's other programs that complement this subsidy. For example, let's see basketball or soccer in this instance. $150 towards registration. Then parents form little groups that they can have agreements of pick up, drop off, so they can save the petrol. There's Facebook groups that have hand-me-downs on equipment and clothing and soccer boots and all the rest of it. So there are ways and there are in place. And if you are one of those parents struggling and you value sport and your child engaging in sport, you find ways. So the deeper question is, are parents losing the interest in using that ever changing and ever sort of decreasing disposable income towards kids' engagement with participation in sport? And at the same time, are kids losing interest in either organized or unorganized forms of exercise and participation because they are using a lot of their, time after school or weekends playing online games or spending time on their iPads and their iPhones. And if that's the case, and I'll close here, then shouldn't we be looking at what's appealing to them? And if it's activity through their iPad, give it to them. So there's a whole suite of issues there. And then there's, I think I want to leave on a positive note that there are measures in place and there are challenges at the same time that are changing because the world is changing and the kids are changing.
Ray, you can answer that because having been an athlete, and you've gone through that system, and do you see the same sorts of driving, motivating factors for the next generation coming through that want to participate for the same reasons that you did? Or is that group becoming more watered down as they choose other things?
I don't think so. I mean, I feel like money is a big factor. One of the organisations that I am working with, those vouchers that you're talking about, we have in New South Wales as well. I think it's active kid vouchers. We are in the process of fighting to not lose them. So that is a big issue at the moment. $100 isn't that much per child. Like you're talking about kids that are rural, like that money pays for their registration fee, they still have to drive to sport. Kids with disabilities, it is paying for sport, but it's also paying for the physiotherapy so that they can continue to do sport. And a lot of that is covered by NDIS, but a lot of it isn't as well. So there is that financial factor that you are speaking of that's still quite relevant, even though there is that sort of investment from the government. As far as kids getting involved in sport, certainly there are a lot of kids that are staying inside a lot more, and I do see that with a lot of kids that I work with. But there are still a lot of kids that are motivated by what they see, and unfortunately, there isn't a lot on TV. Certainly, we are getting a lot more female sport on TV, but I don't remember the last time I ever saw a person with disability competing on TV. So, for the kids with disabilities, for me specifically as a kid, I didn't know that there was any sort of disabled pathways, or I didn't know about the Paralympics until I was found by another Paralympian, and he saw potentially need to leave football and go into athletics to pursue Rio. So for me, it's always been about chance meeting with other people. So I think the more we can make things visible, I feel like financially, yes, that's a barrier, and maybe there is more interest in indoor activities, but I think with more visibility, we could see a lot more change.
I would thank you, Poppy, for reminding us, that there are these good programs out there. There's good news out there. Sometimes it's harder to see than you're like, oh no, I mean, we're here at the World Cup, we're having a good time, we're having a good tournament. So that's good to point out. I think one of the things we need to look at is not just do kids want to play sport, but are they interested in the type of sport that we're offering? Tracey mentioned that, you know, that swim, I think it was swimming that looked the exact same as it did 25 years ago. Are we teaching sport the same way we did 25 years ago? Are we doing PE? You know, usually the child's first introduction into sport and physical activity. Are we teaching that in a way that's relevant to Gen Z? I mean, my daughter's supposed to be sitting over there. I don't know where she went, but she's wandered off. So, I mean, I have a 16-year-old and 13-year-old daughter, and like, they're very different people, and they have a very different experience than I had. And I think we have not adapted well. It's not that kids don't still want to go out and play. They just might have different types of interests. They might have the communication we use needs to be different and adapted and updated. And I don't think maybe we're so great at that.
That's interesting. The specificity, I think you're describing, of type of programming in the Indigenous sector is even more important, that it's the actual training and the way the program's delivered and the way the sport is nurtured and the way kids are trained, that it does have a strong cultural lens that provides the opportunities to succeed in communities that are Australia's most disadvantaged by a really, really long shot, really long way. And I think the stakes are much higher in really disadvantaged communities, because football can be a way that a kid goes to school on a Friday. In fact, we have many principals in our 20 public schools in Queensland, New South Wales and Northern Territory say it was like, you know, these kids didn't ever come on Fridays. Now because Friday football's on a Friday morning, they come in the morning and they stay all day. And, you know, one of the kids was probably, you know, the class muck up front. He was always the kid in trouble, but now he's a leader. The other kids have seen how incredible he is on the football pitch. And now, you know, they look up to him and he has a different view of life. So these stakes are a lot higher where the disadvantage is a lot deeper. And I think there's a real obligation and a responsibility from Australia in particular, if we're talking about this World Cup in here, to question, you know, what is the legacy that will remain for Indigenous players who have the least access to the game are Australia's most disadvantaged children and youth.
Okay, James Buckell from Sydney University. I'm just going to ask a question regarding inclusion. I think inclusion is sort of the idea of inclusion is at the highest point it's ever been, which is awesome. But at the same time, volunteerism is going down across a lot of sports, especially grassroots sports. These days, a lot of people expect to be paid to coach or be involved in sport. How does that affect, I guess, para-athletes, Indigenous athletes and female sport as well?
I run, as I mentioned earlier, multi-sports days for kids with disabilities to get involved in sport, see what sport they like, and then try and create a pathway through that sport for them to stay involved for the day. I held the first ever day we've had on the Central Coast last weekend. I had 200 people there and no volunteers. So there is definitely an issue with getting people involved in volunteering. I think it's a little bit easier when it comes to disability because unfortunately you've still got that warm fuzzy feeling that you've helped people, and certainly I had some incredible friends and family and people part of my community, obviously being from the Central Coast, come and help out on the day, leaving in tears. A lot of these kids haven't tried sport before, so there is definitely an issue with trying to find people to come and volunteer their time. Women's sport, you know, there isn't as much funding as we say with compared to men's, but in para sport we get nothing. It's all volunteer based, and if anything, you know, in alpine skiing and athletics where it's a little bit more high performance, we were paid, but in football it's actually costing us money just to go and do our medical screenings for Football Australia to say that we're able to go and actually compete for Australia. So there is just no money in para sports. So yeah, it is hard, but it is people that are involved in sport from the grassroots who have just fallen in love with the sport that continue to come back, and I guess it's word of mouth and having people say this was an incredible day, 200 people there. I actually had people come up to me after the day being like, how can we fund this next year? How can we get involved next year? How can we promote it more? So unfortunately, I guess with parasport at least, it is all word of mouth and hopefully, because we are a newer sport compared to women's sport, we'll grow from here. So you're saying something?
I think volunteering needs quite a structural approach to make it effective. It's quite hard to integrate volunteers if you have a structured program. So for us, for instance, in the bush, we've got people lining up who want to come to the bush and volunteer, but that also stretches our resources, and sometimes it will prevent local people from developing into the role that you want them to. The volunteering also needs to be, in one sense, skilled. And, I think the World Cup is full of volunteers who have really happily taken 4 weeks or part of that out of their work year. I wonder if the game itself could mobilise volunteering force for the game in general and where the opportunities are. I think also parent tutors and others in areas of a lack of inclusion should be calling on the game itself, calling the governing body. Maybe the structural change is that the Para World Cup is held at the same time as the Women's World Cup and Men's World Cups, because that's what happens in the Olympics. So maybe there's lessons to learn from other sports and other events to change things like that up, because football has a power that no other sport has, I think, and that is inclusion.
Would you please thank our wonderful guests, Ross, Ray, and Sarah. To break for lunch. I believe that's an hour. 45 minutes. It's 45 minutes. So please feel free. I can see that there's stuff all set up on the table over there, and we'll be back in 45 minutes time. Thank you.